Well, I think that artists always have a good eye for real estate. You know, there's a rat cunning in artists about seeking out good places to live and to work.
It was quite secluded, I think is probably the best word. It was a little sort of area very close to the city, and it wasn't too expensive. Those things are very attractive to artists.
In those days, Lavender Bay was a renter's place. Nobody really much owned buildings. Like my house here was 7 flats.
Those houses, they weren't brilliantly livable. You know, they were more boarding houses than artist studios or expansive sort of places to enjoy life.
It was a full-on working harbour bay. It looked like there were 17 boat sheds in Lavender Bay.
When North Sydney Council in the 50s designated it as an industrial area. Now, it's inconceivable today that a council with such an important part of Sydney would even contemplate it as an industrial area. The result of all of that was property values were extraordinarily cheap. It became a very, very cheap place to live. But it was the availability of disused factory and waterside boat sheds and things like that that gave the opportunity for artists to work there at a low cost.
Back in the day, I mean, there was just car wrecks and lantana, cats roaming around. You know, it wasn't a place you'd want to go to.
It was a dead end. The addition of the boardwalk that you can walk around to Luna Park wasn't there. So you came down those steps. The only reason to come down them really was if you were going to catch the ferry down there, because there was nowhere else to go.
It was a little bit of a secret. It was quite a bucolic little village almost in a sense, because it was off the road and it had the park in front of it, and then of course the old railway line, which wasn't used very much, and then the water.
In one word, it was magic. It was magic. I mean, you couldn't have imagined a more extraordinary place.
It's an extraordinarily magical bay on its own, but people didn't know about it. We were very lucky, and in some ways I think, oh, I shouldn't have told anybody, but you know.
What first brought me to Lavender Bay, I went to school at Shaw. It was just above Lavender Bay. Little did I know that I would be living there sometime, and it was another world.
I actually took residence in McMahon's Point and hence Lavender Bay, and became very much a part of my life, and virtually have never moved away from Lavender Bay.
We actually came here to visit a friend and just were mesmerised by the bay. And then they just said, well, the flat upstairs is becoming vacant. So we had a look and we just went, wow. I mean, it was really dark, really gloomy, and all cut up into small rooms with floral wallpaper and God knows what. But I mean, it had the bay out there.
Rooms came up in a house next door to the Whiteleys. Tom Carment was there. I think he had rooms there.
When I first went there, Brett and Wendy were living in number 1 Walker Street. And sometime later on, Tim Storrier moved to about 4 houses up.
A house came up there, and I knew where Brett lived, and of course Peter Kingston had a house there. In fact, if you go to any city, if you go to buy into any city, find out where the artists are moving, because they always have a good eye for it on value and beauty, usually.
I got to know Brett well, and him and Wendy moved into Lavender Bay, so we came over here a lot. And then the house next door came up, and I was able to buy half of it, unfortunately dislodging an artist who was staying at the front part of the house called Tom Carment.
In years to come, of course, I got to know Peter and still go and visit him sometimes at 3 Walker Street, so it's interesting. He's making prints in the rooms where I used to live at the bottom of number 3.
The Sydney art community divided itself north and south of the harbour. The Lavender Bay group was definitely a collection of artists, John First Smith, Garry, Shead, Tim Storrier, Brett Whiteley and many, many people through the artists, I think, through their encouragement and their paintings and their description of what Lavender Bay is, became a very, very popular place for other people to live.
I just loved the idea of this scene that was evolving. I think I've described it as a sort of a bayside bohemia.
Lavender Bay became a haven because the bay itself was the muse. Lavender Bay was this little bay that nature had provided in a busy harbour that became, out of its sheer extravagance of its own beauty, a haven for it. It was a mecca. We were tripping, all of us, on the beauty of the place. It was very romantic, very conducive to creative work, to art.
Kingo used to go down and do drawings of the boats in the harbour. He was fascinated with it, and of course Brett was too. I can paint sea, but I'm not a person who is at all interested in little boats bobbing about.
Every week there'd be a beautiful new ketch or ferry or something. There's plenty of things to draw. I love that, and of course Brett loved that.
The view that Brett took was actually took from his house, although a lot of them were done, almost from memory. He was so familiar with it.
The Lavender Bay pictures are really a celebration of the beauty of this bay and being here and living here.
People can look at a sort of a bit of history that's been made there now, and I think enjoy the fact that the creators of Lavender Bay, the people that came and went, the filmmakers, had this moment. And of course, one of the things that cemented us all together was making the Phantom movie.
It was very interesting that that Garry was in the film at the same time. It wasn't just painting, filmmaking, although it was a pretty shaky affair.
In that whole period, I made about four or five films featuring some part of Lavender Bay. The film of Fanta, which is, of course, the Phantom.
Well, it was pretty hairy, actually, because a lot of material was shot. One thing was lacking was a script. Minor detail.
We didn't have a script, so I just shot it. Once we'd finished shooting, I was thinking, we can turn this into a dream of some naive young man thinking he's the Phantom, and that's what it is.
It's all a fantasy in this sort of callow youth's head that he might be the Phantom. This is Kingo, of course. He'd love to be the Phantom, but he's not quite the Phantom.
Kingo was running around in the Phantom suit that doesn't fit, with all the wrinkles.
It was a schmozzle, really. There's two Phantoms in it, of course. I played the Daydream Phantom, and then there's the real Phantom, who is played by Gavin Wilson. Wendy played Dinah Palmer, and Brett played the driver. He drove his mini-moke, and there were dogs, and Michael Hobbs played Alvo Alto, the villain, and John First Smith played one of the crooks. So it was just whoever was around.
I just loved filming them, and we could all watch it at the end. That was the whole point. We'd make the film, and then we'd have a party and screening. So it was really good fun.
I remember there was a certain sort of camaraderie among everyone, and it seemed like there was a great openness to discuss things.
From an artistic point of view, there's a lot of ideas are arbitrated casually, socially. It always has been. And to be close to that is quite a privilege in a sense, because you do understand then the way a lot of people are thinking, and you get a feel for the passion of people, and that can be very nourishing and rewarding if for an artist. I mean, you remember that all painters, they all work on their own. So a sense of community can be very important.
We were very supportive of each other, all of us.
The relationships were genuine and people looked out for one another.
I think that Brett and Wendy were actually very kind to me because I was just this young fella. And Tim Storrier, despite the fact that his style of painting was so different to mine, or was different to Brett's as well, was always very encouraging as well. So that was good when you're young to get encouragement, and it helps you carry on.
Certainly, without a doubt, watching how all these artists work and getting to know what they were doing and so forth. It was one of the reasons I moved, I'd have to say that, and to learn a little more about how Brett worked and so forth. And yeah, I learned a lot. A lot of it was rubbish, of course. A lot of it was transitory. A lot of it had to do with fashion. But that can be kind of useful too. But I learned how different artists think and different artists work and different artists behave. So it was a very informative place to live for me.
So I remember watching Tim Storrier paint. To actually watch people paint was very instructive. Tim was very, very patient and calm. And I remember one day Brett was painting alongside him, doing that big blue painting that I think is in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And the contrast between them was quite interesting because Brett was dancing backwards and forwards in front of his canvas and throwing terps at it and then zeroing in on details. It was only a very occasional thing that you'd look at each other's work, and I preferred that. I'd rather just get on with it quietly, and then maybe every 3 months or 6 months it's valuable to have someone else or ask someone else's advice or have a look at what you're doing. But if it happened too regular, I don't think I'd like that. That would be too much of an artist commune for me. I value others' advice, but only in small doses.
Robert, who was a close friend of mine, lived in John Firth Smith's house, and Robert had a way with the ladies in a way, and he had these rooms there with a terrace, and I remember every summer it was called the Terrace Lounge because Bob was there and there were always very pretty girls hanging around, and Bob and the Terrace Lounge were quite famous, and there were a lot of parties that he'd have there in the summer. Again, everybody was young. It was those days, and heavens above, on balconies around Lavender Bay in the late afternoon, was as good as the Riviera as far as we were all concerned. And you didn't have to speak French.
But the G-spot of Lavender Bay was 1 Walker Street where Brett and Wendy lived, and it became this fire that people came to warm their brains and minds and senses on.
Those parties at the Whiteley's, I went to quite a few of those. Let me see. Well, if you can remember it, it means you weren't there, but...
Oh yes, well there's certainly too much drinks. Yes, it wasn't for the faint-hearted to be involved in things in those days.
Oh no, it's just a blancmange of disorder. I mean, they were raucous, loud parties, and quite often somebody would bring along a visiting celebrity. Brett introduced me to Bob Geldorf there one day. He was in town with the Boomtown Rats.
Bob Dylan was there, Mark Knopfler was there, Eric Clapton was there, Phil Noyce was there, Gerard Depardieu was there.
Peter O'Toole or Glenda Jackson or...
Jennifer Clare, Anna Marie Winchester would turn up, and, you know, Brian Brown. The girls from Hanging Rock would turn up. There they were. Miranda. But, you know, drinks flowed and pot, whatever. I mean, you know, it was all part of just having a good time in those days.
The music was very, very loud. There was a lot of booze, and the food was wonderful. Everybody looked incredible. There's a lot of dancing, a lot of flirting, a lot of naughtiness, you know, and having swims in the pool in the middle of the night.
Brett contemplated actually diving off the balcony into the pool. I managed to talk him out of that, but he thought he would make it. But people did really dumb things when they were drunk.
I remember going to one party briefly after an opening at Benarthans, I think, where there was a lot of that sort of flowy dancing later on, and I didn't really feel like I was part of that scene.
It was, to use a word from the 60s, it was a scene. And of course it was overlooked and controlled very much by Wendy, who was a great hostess and knew how to put on a party, and she certainly knew how to dress up. People did dress up a bit in those days, you know.
We were all much younger and we were having parties and we were all drinking, you know. All of that stuff that one doesn't do now. There was probably a bit of dope smoking going on. I don't think any of us considered ourselves to be hippies, ever. But bohemians of the old-fashioned kind, you know, do what you like, drink too much, experiment with drugs and things. We could identify with that fairly easily. You know, I started doing the smudgy eyeline makeup because I'd seen the most amazing photograph of Colette in her old age with the black dripping down on her face, you know, and I thought, oh, that's the way I want to look. It then gets taken up in a much later generation by a bunch of models, and they call it the heroine look, you know, so I wouldn't have minded that look when I was 17, 18, and when I got it out of reality, it wasn't so great, you know, but anyway.
I suppose the lubricant we all enjoyed was mostly, you know, alcohol, booze. But then there was grass and a bit of LSD and a bit of this and that. But it was never really, it never got serious till heroin arrived on the scene. And then even when it arrived, it wasn't a big deal until Brett and Wendy, of course, they started to really take to it. And of course, the consequences are drastic. The consequences are real. It was like the dynamics changed. You know, the shutters went down, a different, what would you say, the people that used to come and go, they were dealers, suppliers. They tried to manage this as best they could, and they had, let's face it, they had the resources to keep, you know, I mean, Brett was a successful artist, so he was able to keep the wolf from the door for as long as, you know, until their physical conditions deteriorated and things had to be done, something had to give.
When he started using heroin, at first he was just in love with it, you know, he thought it was fabulous. He used to say, it's on the money for me, you know, and he just, after many years, long time, it started to exhaust him. He became exhausted and very sad and very sick, mentally sick.
I noticed Brett became a different person. He wasn't the Brett we knew. It was so sad.
And we tried quite often to come off it. When we went to a treatment centre in England together, that didn't last very long. When I did get off it, I was 1 year clean, and I came back from London and met him in India, in Bombay, and he was stoned already, but I thought, oh, well, I'm strong enough, I'll get him off when we get back to Sydney, you know, but of course one doesn't. In the end, of course, the heroin addiction had a devastating effect on us, because I just couldn't go back there. And, you know, I just had to say, you can't be here, you can't be in this house, you've got to move out, you've got to, you know, live somewhere else. It was awful. I mean, the way that affected the end of his life, but still clinging to that belief that he could control it.
That was a whole era of my life at Lavender Bay, and it was time to, move on. Yeah.
It was just a group of people living out their lives, loving, fighting, working.
As the line goes, the past is another country. The second line is, of course, they do things differently there. And in many ways, they used to do things differently, that's for sure.
I sort of live more in the present these days, and where you choose to live obviously means something. And really, I could really spend the rest of my time just painting details around here.
It just seemed like a place where I had some friends. It was a beautiful place. It was just a fantastic place to live, really. So I still go back occasionally. It doesn't seem to have changed that much, physically at least. But the people have moved on. It's probably a different atmosphere now.
Well, I mean, it was a lovely period for a certain amount of time. There's no doubt about it. For all sorts of different reasons, people drifted away, moved off, died. You know, it ended like all things, with some tragedy here and there. But for a period, it was where I wanted to be. That's for sure.